Welcome back, once more, to Relaxation Philosophy. This is the third and final of our quiet evenings together, with Søren Kierkegaard. Wherever you are tonight, whatever has brought you back here, take a moment before we begin to settle into the room around you. Let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw loosen. Take a deep, slow breath in, and a longer, softer breath out. In our first quiet evening, we met a thin, melancholic man walking the lamplit streets of 19th century Copenhagen. We learned about the inheritance of sorrow he carried, his stubborn rebellion against the great systems of his age, his insistence that some truths can only be inhabited, not observed. In our second evening, we stood at the edge of an imaginary cliff and felt, just for a moment, the small double sensation he called the dizziness of freedom. We stood too at the door at the end of reason, and noticed that there are moments in a human life where the next step is not a step of thought, but a step of life. Tonight we walk, slowly, into the heart of what Kierkegaard left us. The three great stages on life's way: the aesthetic life of the seducer and the wanderer, the ethical life of the husband and the citizen, and the strange, trembling religious life of the one who is asked, like Abraham on the mountain, to do something no system can explain. We will linger in the candlelit world of either/or. We will stand on the high, terrible ridge of fear and trembling. We will meet what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, the quiet despair that runs through so many ordinary lives. And we will sit, finally, with the strangest of all his figures, the Knight of Faith. As always, there is no need to grasp every concept, no need to remember every name. Let the ideas come to you the way evening comes to a room, unhurried, gradually, until the whole space is changed, without you quite noticing how. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. And let us walk, together, into the final evening. Chapter 9. The Three Stages on Life's Way. One of Kierkegaard's quietest gifts to us is the way he mapped the inner geography of a human life. He did not believe that all people lived the same kind of life, not in any deep sense. He believed that there were, broadly, three ways a human being could stand in the world, three orientations of the soul, three sheltered rooms in which a person could, for a longer or shorter time, take up residence. He called them the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage. These are not stages of age. Exactly. A child can live, in a small way, ethically. An old man can be, in his bones, an aesthete. They are not even, strictly speaking, stages you must pass through one after another. Some people remain in the aesthetic life for the whole of their days, and never feel any reason to leave it. Some skip lightly from one to another and back again. Some live, in different parts of themselves, in 2 or 3 of these rooms at once. But the rooms are real. They are real shapes of the inner life, real ways of being a person, real choices, hidden inside the texture of our days, about what kind of being we are going to be. Kierkegaard describes each one with such tenderness and such precision that you will recognize, almost certainly, something of yourself in each. He is not trying to flatter you. He is not trying to scold you. He is doing what he always does, holding up a quiet mirror and letting you see yourself in the soft, candlelit honesty of his prose. The aesthetic life, he says, is the life lived for the moment, for sensation, for pleasure, for beauty, for interest. A life that asks, again and again, what is exciting, what is delightful, what is new. A life whose great enemy is not evil, but boredom. Again and again, what is right, what is mine to do, who am I becoming through the steady accumulation of small choices. And then there is the religious life, the strangest of the three, the hardest to describe, the one Kierkegaard himself was most reluctant to speak about directly, because he believed that the moment you spoke of it too plainly, you began to falsify it. The religious life is not, for Kierkegaard, the life of conventional church-going, or correct doctrine, or moral seriousness raised to a slightly higher pitch. The religious life is what begins, when even the ethical life has been pushed to its limit, and found inadequate. When you stand, in some essential moment, alone before God, with no system, no formula, no crowd, no proof, and must, somehow, trust. We will move, tonight, slowly through each, not to judge them, not to rank them, but to feel, gently, the shape of each as Kierkegaard drew it. And perhaps, somewhere underneath, to notice quietly which of these rooms your own soul has been sitting in, without ever quite naming it. Chapter 10. The Aesthetic Life. The aesthetic life is the first room most of us live in, and many of us never leave. Kierkegaard does not say this with contempt. He understands the aesthetic life from the inside, because he had lived in it himself, because in some way a part of him still did. He describes it with such charm and intelligence that, in his book, Either/Or, many of his earliest readers thought he was endorsing it. He was not, but he was honoring it. He was showing it in full color, so that its truth and its tragedy could be felt together. The aesthete, in Kierkegaard's account, is the person whose life is organized around the moment, around feeling, around interest, around the search for what is beautiful, what is delightful, what is unexpected, what is rare. The aesthete is not, necessarily, a hedonist in the crude sense. The aesthete may love music, poetry, ideas, travel, food, romantic possibility, solitude in beautiful rooms, the slow turning of seasons. He may even love philosophy, provided it remains interesting. What unifies all of this is that the aesthete asks of every experience the same quiet question. Is this interesting? Does this stir me? Does this lift, even briefly, the soft gray veil of ordinariness? You can already feel how natural this orientation is, how it lives, quietly, inside almost every modern life. The hours spent scrolling, looking for something new, the restless rotation of hobbies and interests, the plans for the next trip, the next meal, the next show, the next romance, the deep, unspoken assumption that life is essentially a long sequence of experiences that should, where possible, be made vivid. There is nothing shameful in this, Kierkegaard says. The aesthetic dimension is real. Beauty matters. Interest matters. The capacity to be moved is one of the great signs of a human soul. The problem is not that the aesthete enjoys things. The problem is what happens when the entire weight of a life is asked to rest on enjoyment. Because here, gently, the aesthetic life begins to reveal its hidden crack. The crack is boredom. Kierkegaard, in the voice of one of his aesthete pseudonyms, writes one of the most haunting essays in his work, called The Rotation of Crops. In it, he describes the aesthete's life as a perpetual battle against boredom. The aesthete has, he says, discovered the great fact of human existence, namely that all things are boring. And so the aesthete becomes, of necessity, a master strategist of variety. He must rotate his pleasures the way a farmer rotates crops, so that no field is exhausted, so that no taste becomes stale, so that the next experience always carries the slight thrill of novelty. He must never commit too deeply. Commitment is, for the aesthete, the enemy. Commitment ties him to one place, one person, one project, and thereby exposes him to the slow, inevitable boredom. That comes when the first thrill has passed. So he lives instead, in a perpetual condition of light, half-detached engagement, always ready to move on, always slightly elsewhere, always rotating crops. The most vivid portrait Kierkegaard gives us of this life is in a long, strange, beautiful document he calls the Seducer's Diary. The seducer is the aesthete in his most refined and unsettling form. He is not a brute. He is not a predator in any obvious sense. He is something more disturbing. He is an artist, whose chosen medium is another human being. The seducer, Johannes, selects a young woman, Cordelia, and devotes himself, with extraordinary patience, to the slow art of awakening her, shaping her, bringing her to a state of full inward bloom, in which she has fallen entirely in love with him, and has come, herself, to choose him over everything. At the precise moment when this is accomplished, when she has become, you might say, his most beautiful and complete creation, he leaves her. He does not leave her out of cruelty. He leaves her because the experience he was constructing has reached its perfect moment, and any further step, any actual life together, would only spoil the work of art. What he wanted, all along, was the experience, not the person, not the future, not the long, ordinary work of being someone's husband. He wanted the curve of the experience, from its first faint stirring to its richest possible flowering. And once that curve had been completed, there was nothing left for him to do but begin again, elsewhere. There is something monstrous about Johannes the Seducer, of course. But Kierkegaard is not asking you only to recoil from him. He is asking you very gently to notice the small, refined Johannes, who lives in the heart of every aesthetic existence. The voice that says, "Not yet. Let me not commit to this just yet." The voice that says, "The experience is what matters, not the long, ordinary aftermath." The voice that quietly leaves, the moment something becomes routine. The voice that always has, one foot already pointed toward the door. The aesthetic life, Kierkegaard says, has a particular kind of sorrow. It is the sorrow of the person who has tasted everything and committed to nothing, who has felt much and built little, who finds, late at night, that all the rotated crops have somehow left the field bare. He describes this sorrow, in another of his beautiful passages, as the despair of possibility. The aesthete keeps every possibility open, out of a fear of being trapped by any actuality. But the result of keeping all possibilities open is that none of them ever become real. The aesthete lives, finally, in a kind of mist, surrounded by glittering, half-imagined futures, none of which are actually his, standing in a beautiful field of seeds that have never been planted. And so the aesthetic life, however shimmering it can be, runs into its own internal limit. The limit is the discovery that a human being cannot, in the end, be a self, by being only an audience to its own experiences. At some point, something asks to be committed to. Some person, some work, some calling, some love. And here, gently, the door to the next stage of life begins to open. Chapter 11. The Ethical Life. The ethical life begins when something inside the aesthete grows tired of mist, tired of the rotation of crops, tired of always standing slightly outside life, appraising it, ready to move on, tired of being the audience, when something quieter and stronger is asking to be the protagonist. In either/or, Kierkegaard gives the stage its own voice. The voice of an older, slightly heavier man, named Judge William. The judge is a married man, a public servant, a friend of the young aesthete to whom he is writing, a man whose days are arranged around duties that the aesthete would find painfully ordinary. He goes to work. He comes home. He loves his wife. He raises his children. He carries out the small, undramatic obligations of citizenship with quiet faithfulness. And he writes the young aesthete a long letter, trying to explain something that the aesthete cannot quite see from where he stands. The judge says, in effect, you have mistaken life for a series of experiences. You think the question is always, how do I get the next interesting thing? But there is another question, older and quieter, that the moment of pleasure can never answer. The question is, who am I becoming? The judge believes, and Kierkegaard, in this voice, makes the case beautifully, that a self is not something you have. A self is something you become, through the slow accumulation of choices. Every time you commit to something, every time you keep a promise, every time you let your life take on a particular shape, rather than another, you are doing the quiet, invisible work of becoming someone. The aesthete, by refusing to commit, believes he is keeping himself free. The judge says, gently, that the opposite is true. The aesthete is not free. He is dispersed, scattered across countless half-tasted possibilities, none of which he has gathered up into a life. He is, the judge says, a man who has so many selves that he has not yet become any of them. The ethical life is what happens when the aesthete finally chooses. And Kierkegaard, through Judge William, spends pages describing what this means. It is not, primarily, the choice of one thing rather than another, this career rather than that one, this lover rather than that one. It is, much more deeply, the choice of choosing itself. The decision to be the kind of being who takes up its own existence, who answers for it, who becomes a self, by gathering its scattered possibilities into a single, faithful life. The judge gives, as his great example, the institution of marriage. He is not speaking of marriage merely as a legal arrangement, or even merely as a romantic vow. He is speaking of marriage as the small, daily, unglamorous form that ethical existence often takes. The aesthete, the judge says, is fascinated by the moment of falling in love, the trembling beginning, the first kiss, the early thrill of revelation. And then, the aesthete believes, the whole thing must inevitably decline into duty and routine. The poetic vanishes, the interesting fades. The marriage becomes, in his eyes, the graveyard of the romantic. The judge laughs at this, gently. He says the aesthete has it exactly backwards. The thrill of falling in love is a small thing, beautiful, but small. Anyone can feel it. It happens to people whether they choose it or not. The real human achievement, the real poetic accomplishment, is the continued faithfulness of married love over years and decades. The slow weaving of two lives into one shared shape. The thousand small choices, day after day, to keep choosing the same person. To stand by them through illness, through ordinary disappointment, through the disclosures of weakness that no first kiss could have predicted. That, the judge says, is not the death of poetry. That is what poetry was always trying to point at. You can hear in this voice something deeply attractive, something that calls quietly to many of us in our restless modern condition. The aesthetic life can be exhausting. The constant search for novelty, the inability to settle, the fear of commitment, all of it leaves a kind of soft fatigue in the bones. The ethical life offers something else. A weight, a ground, a sense that one's days are accumulating into a shape that means something. A self being built, slowly, out of small acts of fidelity. Kierkegaard is genuinely fond of the judge. He gives him some of the most beautiful prose in either/or. He lets him win, you might say, the long argument with the aesthete. And yet, in the deepest layer of his work, Kierkegaard does not stop here. He believes that the ethical life, beautiful as it is still not the final word. There is something it cannot see. There is a limit it cannot, by its own resources, fully cross. Because the ethical life, for all its dignity, believes that the highest task of a human being is to fulfill the demands of his role, to be a good husband, a good citizen, a good father, a good worker, to take up the universal duties of human existence and discharge them faithfully. The ethical hero is the person who has become completely his duty. But Kierkegaard, with great gentleness, begins to ask a strange question. What if there is something deeper inside a person than even the most beautiful set of duties? What if there is, somewhere, an individual self that cannot be fully expressed in any role, any system, any general law, however good? What if the highest task of a human being is not finally to disappear into the universal, but to become, before God, a single irreplaceable particular, whose deepest life cannot be captured by any rule that applies to everyone? This is the strange, trembling thought that leads Kierkegaard out of the judge's well-lit parlor and onto a high, dark mountain, where an old man named Abraham is preparing to do something that no ethical system can defend. But before we walk with him there, we must spend a few quiet minutes with what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. Chapter 12. The sickness unto death. In a small, dense, beautiful book, published under one of his strangest pseudonyms, Anti-Climacus, Kierkegaard wrote what may be the most penetrating analysis of despair ever set down on paper. He called the book The Sickness Unto Death, and he opens it with a sentence that has puzzled and haunted readers ever since. The self, he writes, is a relation that relates itself to itself. You can hear, perhaps, something almost playful in the formula, the way it folds back on itself, like a ribbon being tied. But underneath the play, there is a deep idea. A human being, he is saying, is not simply a fact in the world, the way a stone is a fact, or a tree is a fact. A human being is a creature that has a relationship with itself, that can observe its own thoughts, that can be pleased or disappointed with what it sees, that can promise and break promises, remember and forget, decide, hide, hope. A being whose existence is something it must, in some way, take up. And precisely because of this, a human being is exposed to a particular kind of suffering that no animal can suffer. The suffering of being a self that has failed to become itself. This, for Kierkegaard, is what despair really is. Despair is not, in his view, the loud, dramatic state we usually picture. Despair is rarely loud. Despair is, much more often, the quiet condition of a person whose life is not quite their own, whose self has not been allowed to come fully into being. He distinguishes several forms of despair, each more subtle than the last. There is the despair of the person who does not know he is in despair. The most common form, he says, the person who fills his days with work, distraction, respectability, small pleasures, and feels, on the whole, that life is going well enough. And yet underneath, unspoken, unsuspected, there is a self that has never been allowed to speak. A self that he has, without quite noticing, traded away for the comfortable shape of a life that everyone else around him approves of. There is the despair of weakness, the person who has begun to glimpse that there is a self he was meant to become, and recoils from the task. who feels the weight of it, and prefers, gently, to stay smaller than he might have been, who chooses the comfortable half-life over the trembling work of becoming. There is the despair of defiance, the person who has seen what he was meant to become, and has refused, not out of weakness, but out of pride, who insists on constructing his self entirely on his own terms, according to a no measure but his own, who would rather build a brilliant counterfeit self than receive the real one as a quiet gift. What unites all these forms of despair, in Kierkegaard's account, is that the self has not allowed itself to rest in what he calls, in his most carefully chosen phrase, the power that established it. He means God, but he says it slowly, indirectly, the way a person says something tender in the dark. The despairing self, he says, is the self that is trying to be itself, without acknowledging that it was given to itself, that it did not invent its own existence, that its very freedom is, in some way, a freedom it has been entrusted with, not a freedom it has manufactured from nothing. The cure for despair, then, is not a louder version of self-assertion. It is not a more brilliant strategy of self-construction. The cure for despair, in his strange, quiet formula, is for the self to rest transparently in the power that established it. You may receive that phrase tonight however you can. You may receive it as a statement about God, in the full, traditional sense. You may receive it more gently, as a statement about the deeper ground of our being, the source we did not choose, the great quiet from which our lives have been lent to us. Kierkegaard would not, here, force a decision. He would only ask you to notice that something in you, sometimes, recognizes the difference between trying to hold yourself up and allowing yourself to be held. The deepest sleep, in some way, is the small picture of this. The moment, every night, when you finally stop trying to manage your own existence and let consciousness slip from your hands into a darkness that holds you, without your help. You did not invent this rhythm. You did not earn it. It was given to you, and it gives you back to yourself, hour after hour, in the long, slow trust of laying yourself down. Kierkegaard would not say that sleep is faith, but he might say, gently, that the soul learns something there, that it is being asked to learn, in larger ways, during its waking life, that it is held, even when it does not know how. Chapter 13. Fear and Trembling. There is a book Kierkegaard wrote under the strange pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, Johannes of Silence, that he believed, in his most private hours, might be the book his name would outlast him by. He was right. The book is Fear and Trembling, and it begins with an old familiar story that Kierkegaard insists we have never truly heard. The story is the story of Abraham, an old man in the long, dim distance of the ancient world, who is told, by the God he has trusted his whole life, to take his beloved son, Isaac, the child of his old age, the child of the promise, up onto a mountain and offer him there as a sacrifice. Most people, Kierkegaard says, have heard this story so often that they no longer hear it at all. It has become a smooth Sunday school coin. Abraham is admirable. Abraham is obedient. Abraham trusts. And in the end, God spares the boy. A happy ending. A moral lesson. Move along. But Kierkegaard, in the voice of Johannes of Silence, refuses to let us move along. He asks us to stand on that mountain with the old man, the bound boy, the raised knife, and to feel, for one long, terrible moment, what is actually happening. By every ordinary measure, Abraham is about to commit murder. He is about to kill the son he loves more than his own life. There is no ethical system in the world that can defend this act. The judge of our previous chapter, with all his beautiful talk of duty and faithfulness, would recoil in horror. A father's first duty is to his child. A man's first duty is to the moral law. Abraham, by every available standard, is a monster. And yet, the tradition has always called him not a monster, but the father of faith. Kierkegaard asks, with terrible patience, how can this be? His answer is one of the strangest in the history of thought. He says that Abraham represents a possibility that the ethical life cannot contain. A possibility he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. The idea that there are moments when the single individual, standing alone before God, is asked to do something that the universal moral law cannot justify, because the relationship between this individual and God is higher than any law. This is not Kierkegaard's recommendation, of course. He is not telling us to go climb a mountain and hurt anyone. He is doing something stranger, and more careful. He is using the most extreme possible case to draw out an essential feature of the religious life. That the religious life, at its deepest, is not the ethical life with more incense. It is a different relation altogether. A relation in which the single individual stands answerable to something that no general principle, no community, no inherited code, can fully mediate. What makes Abraham's case so terrifying, Kierkegaard says, is that Abraham cannot explain himself. He cannot turn to his servants on the way up the mountain and say, I am doing this for such and such universal reason. Anyone who heard him would, rightly, stop him. Abraham must walk in silence. He must carry the weight alone. He cannot share it, cannot dissolve it into the public language of ethics, cannot find shelter in any crowd. He is, in the most absolute sense, a single individual. The first, perhaps, in the long story of human faith. And here is the strangest part of Kierkegaard's reading. He says that the truly astonishing thing about Abraham is not merely that he was willing to give up Isaac. A great tragic hero could do that, sacrificing one love for another higher cause. The astonishing thing is that Abraham, even as he raised the knife, still believed, somehow, that he would not lose Isaac. That he would walk back down the mountain with the boy beside him. Not because he could explain how, not because reason gave him any grounds for the hope, but because he trusted, beyond reason, in the goodness of the one who had given Isaac to him in the first place. This, Kierkegaard says, is faith. Not the easy faith of agreeing with doctrines, not the comfortable faith of belonging to a community, but the strange, trembling faith that continues to trust in the very moment when trust appears to make no sense at all. The faith that does not require the universe to behave reasonably before it agrees to love it. Chapter 14. The Night of Faith. In the same book, Kierkegaard gives a name to the person who has somehow reached the religious life, in this deep, trembling sense. He calls him the Knight of Faith. You might expect a Knight of Faith to be a dramatic figure, a mystic on a mountainside, a hermit in the desert, a martyr with shining eyes. Kierkegaard, with his quiet humor, tells us this is exactly wrong. The Knight of Faith, he says, looks like everyone else. He imagines meeting one on the street, a perfectly ordinary man, slightly stout, perhaps, whistling a tune, walking home from work, looking forward to dinner. If you saw him, you would assume he was a butcher, or a tax collector, or a respectable middle-class father who had never thought a difficult thought in his life. You would walk past him without a second glance. And yet, Kierkegaard says, this man, in his quiet way, has done something the philosophers can barely describe. He has given up everything, inwardly, into the hands of God, and he has received everything back, in the same gesture, as a gift. He goes home to a meal he did not, in his inmost heart, demand as his right. He kisses a wife he no longer secretly grasps at as his possession. He loves his children without the underground panic, that they must, at all costs, never be lost. He holds his whole life lightly, and yet enjoys it more fully than the man who clutches it. The Knight of Faith, Kierkegaard says, has performed a movement that has two parts. First, he has given up the world, not by walking away from it, but by surrendering, inwardly, his demand that the world must turn out in any particular way. He has stopped requiring his happiness as a condition for his trust. And then, in the same breath, he has received the world back, not as something he possesses, but as something he is given. And so he can enjoy it without grasping it, love it without enslavement, lose it when he must without being destroyed. This is the strangest of Kierkegaard's portraits. A man who has walked through the fire of total surrender and come out the other side, looking like a contented neighbor. A man whose inwardness is so deep that on the outside you cannot see it at all. A man who has, in the most quiet possible way, become a single individual before God, and now lives ordinary days, with extraordinary freedom inside them. Kierkegaard never claims to be such a man. In his journals, again and again, he says, with a kind of soft sorrow, "I am not a knight of faith. I can describe him. I can long for him. I can almost see him from where I stand. But I have not yet myself made the movement." He puts himself, instead, in the position of Johannes of silence, standing at the foot of the mountain, unable to do what Abraham did, unable to look away. And perhaps that is part of what makes him, even now, such an unusual companion in the dark. He does not preach down at us. He does not pretend to have arrived. He stands beside us, at the foot of the mountain, in the small lamplit room of his prose, and shows us gently what a life beyond despair might look like, without claiming to live it himself. Let us begin to slow our minds together for the last time in this long, quiet journey. Over 3 evenings we have walked a long way in the company of a thin, melancholic, slightly stooped man from a small kingdom in the north. We have walked the lamplit streets of Copenhagen with him. We have learned the inheritance of his sorrow, his rebellion against the great systems, his quiet insistence that some truths can only be inhabited, not observed. We have felt the dizziness of freedom on the imaginary edge of a cliff, and stood at the door at the end of reason without being asked to cross it. We have visited the 3 rooms of a human life, the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious. We have sat with the strange sickness unto death, the quiet despair that runs beneath so many ordinary lives. And we have stood on the high mountain with Abraham in his silence, and watched a contented neighbor walk home from work carrying, hidden inside him, the most quiet revolution of the spirit that Kierkegaard could imagine. There is no neat conclusion to draw tonight. Kierkegaard, who hated neat conclusions, would not want us to look for one. What he wanted, all along, was something quieter. To slip inside the reader, under cover of beautiful prose, and leave behind a few small seeds. A faint suspicion that the most important question of your life is not what the universe is, but how you stand inside it. A faint suspicion that the crowd is not where the self is built, that anxiety is not your enemy, that beneath all your strategies for holding your life together, something deeper is being offered, the possibility of being held, rather than holding. You do not have to do anything with these seeds tonight. You do not have to decide. You do not have to leap. You only have to let these long, slow evenings keep working in you, the way evenings do, quietly, gradually, until the whole inner room has changed without you quite noticing how. Some of what we have spoken of tonight, you will remember. Some of it you will forget. Some of it, perhaps the most important of it, will not seem like ideas at all by morning, only a small change in the weather inside you. For now, let your shoulders soften one final time. Let your jaw release. Let the small muscles around your eyes unclench in the dark. Let your breath become almost ordinary, almost unnoticed, moving on its own quiet errand the way it has always known how. If sleep is what you are moving toward, let it come. Do not chase it. Do not measure your progress toward it. Simply let yourself be laid down, the way you have been laid down 10,000 nights before, into a darkness that has always, somehow, held you. You are a single, irreplaceable life, breathing quietly in a room, held for this moment in the soft palm of evening. That is enough. That has always been enough. Thank you for walking these 3 quiet evenings with me. It has been a gift to keep this small lamplit space together. Rest gently.